There are a lot of ways to get Pact of the Chain now. It doesn't really matter to me how you got here, but you're here. And behind today's secret door, Pact of the Chain familiars and what to do with them, 2024. So behind today's secret door, Pact of the Chain familiars and what to do with them, 2024. This is Secret Door, a channel devoted to in-depth discussion about Dungeons and Dragons, and my name is Matt Morich. All right, I have started a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel, your help would be greatly appreciated and much needed. And many thanks to Marcelo, Doug, and Jamie for your support. The link is in the pinned comment and in the description. All right, well, I did a version of this video, the original titled video, Pact of the Chain Familiars and What to Do with Them, 4 years ago. And I figured it was time to do another one because Pact of the Chain has changed rather significantly, and now the parameters are a bit different. So I'm going to put the link for the old video up because I don't want to just go over and kind of redo that whole video. That seems kind of pointless. The video is still pretty valid, but I am going to touch on some of the things there. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, and obviously you're here, if you're interested in the topic, give that video a look for sure. But I will touch on some of the topics there, but I'm going to largely just either try to explore what's going on with Pact of the Chain now, or just give you some new ideas that I've also had. So one of the biggest changes to Pact of the Chain now, maybe you might even argue the biggest change, is that you can now cast Find Familiar with a magic action. This absolutely completely changes the landscape for a Pact of the Chain warlock, or anybody that has Pact of the Chain. The difference between casting Find Familiar as an action or an hour and 10-minute spell, if you're going to be casting it as a ritual, which you most likely were, is huge, especially for a warlock, because the warlock, in that hour that you're casting that spell, what is the rest of the party doing? They're taking a short rest, which you desperately want yourself. Being able to cast the spell as simply as a magic action now does several things, one of which is it relieves a lot of pressure of worry over whether the familiar dies. If the familiar died in the old rules, you were stuck until you were able to cast the spell again, and again we're back into that scenario where you're spending the short rest getting your familiar back, which you desperately want, or are you going to take the short rest and forego getting the familiar? It was a tough position to be in. Now, if the familiar dies, even in combat, you could resummon it. In most cases, I'm going to assume that resummoning in combat is not a terribly good idea, but that isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes it might be a very, very good idea. And now, because of this casting change, the ability to switch between familiars is just now the way of the world. So there are now different familiars that you are going to be able to switch from. I'm going to focus on the best ones, but not just simply the best ones. I also want to talk about some that are better than you probably think they are. And one in particular that has uses that none of the other familiars can offer. So in the beginning, let's talk about what are the two best familiars, at least in my opinion. The Imp is the best overall familiar, in my opinion, and the Pseudo-Dragon is clearly the best of the combat familiars. The Imp has plenty of virtues, and I'm not going to go through every single one, but it has the big thing of the fact that it has flight, invisibility, and has hands, and can do all three of those things at once. Then you start piling on extra things that it can do, like Devil Sight and blah, 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 blah. And what you end up getting is a familiar that's pretty tough to beat. It stands alone from a utility standpoint, and it is very serviceable in combat. And I'll just stop here for a second to talk about the invisible familiars and how they can most easily help in combat. Any of the three familiars that can turn invisible, the imp, the quasit, and the sprite, can all do this. They'll be able to get into combat, perform the help action, and because they're invisible, they'll be able to disengage from the opponent, and the opponent can't do an opportunity attack because you can only do an opportunity attack on a creature that you can see. Now, if that creature is, of course, one of the outliers that can see invisible things, that's a whole different matter, but 99% of the time, they're going to be able, it's essentially like they have the flyby feature that the owl does, but it's based on invisibility. Now, the help action, when it's done for a character that is simply doing average damage in combat, is worth just under 4 points of damage a round. Not only is this effective, but it also is, it doesn't require rolling, which means that not only is it automatically helpful, but it also doesn't consume any time with having to roll anything. And whenever you can remove a roll from being necessary at the table, it's always good. They take up time over time. So the imp is by far the best in terms of overall utility outside of combat, and it can be effective in combat. This is just with the help action. Of course, it has a reasonably good attack, etc., etc., etc. On the flip side of that, in combat, the pseudo-dragon is amazing because the sting, its premier ability, not only has a reasonably good DC of 12 to begin with, but if you did take investment of the Chainmaster, of course, that saving throw now scales with your DC, and it isn't an attack. So the pseudo-dragon is able to sting because it's not an attack, and a familiar is able, as per Find Familiar, a familiar is able to do all other actions except attack, and the sting is not an attack, as crazy as that sounds. So they will be able to perform the sting, whether you have investment of the Chainmaster or not, it will be able to do that round after round after round. However, if you want the sting to be very effective, of course, you're going to want to get investment of the Chainmaster. But the point is, the real value with the pseudo-dragon there is that you don't have to use a bonus action to command it to do it. So for those reasons, the pseudo-dragon is clearly the best of the familiars in combat. I talk about the pseudo-dragon and this idea extensively in a video called Rise of the Pseudo-Dragon, and the link will be in the pinned comment and in the description. The pseudo-dragon, however, has real problems. It has far fewer hit points than the imp, and the quasit. It would be the second best after the imp in terms of utility. It has far fewer hit points. It doesn't have hands, and it can't turn invisible. It does have magic resistance, which is nice, but that's really all it's got defensively. So the pseudo-dragon, as great as it is in combat, is also a glass cannon. But I'm talking about all this because the first premise of what Pact of the Chain Familiars and what to do with them is embrace toggling. So I would say if you simply just toggle between the imp and the pseudo-dragon in terms of forms, you're going to always be in a great position. Now, the default position of having the imp, you really can't lose. The imp is going to be effective in combat, not as effective as the pseudo-dragon, of course, but still effective, still productive in combat. And of course, outside of combat, it's amazing. And we'll get into all that in just a second. So you're never going to be wrong having the imp active. But if your mindset is really about wanting the pseudo-dragon's ability with the sting, then obviously whenever you're in kind of danger situations, you're going to want to be either transforming it from the imp into the pseudo-dragon or whatever, but you're going to want it to be in the pseudo-dragon form. This is going to be a bit of a problem in that, let's say you're in a dungeon, you're in a room, you're fighting in the room, you've got it as a pseudo-dragon, now you're done and you're wanting to do some more scouting. Well, you can have the pseudo-dragon scout. I mean, it can still do that. It's just not nearly as good as the imp. So how many times are you going to change it in a day? Because you still have to pay for the material components of the spell. So if you're doing this multiple times throughout a day, that will begin to add up. But that's just simply, I think, a cost of doing business because the power level we're talking about now, Pact of the Chain was always, in my opinion, the strongest of the boons that you could get for a warlock. Now, it's been magnified. Now, let's touch briefly on Investment at the Chainmaster and how that changes things. Investment at the Chainmaster allows you to give a creature a different movement speed. So in this case, you would probably want to pick flight. So you'll be able to give the Quasit flight. That's the thing that the Quasit lacks. It can turn invisible and it has hands, but the only way it can fly is when it shapeshifts. So it can't do all three of those things at once, which is why it's always behind the Imp, in my opinion. But with Investment at the Chainmaster, the Quasit becomes so comparable to the Imp that the differences are pretty negligible. Bear in mind that if you are of the mindset that you want to take Investment at the Chainmaster, you're going to be able to give flight to any of the creatures, any of the familiars. All right, well, let's talk about probably the most important topic in this whole thing, for me, personally anyway, and that is hands. The Imp has hands, the Quasit has hands, the Sprite has hands, and the Skeleton has hands. Having hands, and I've had people in the comments section talk to me about how the pseudo-dragon they think has hands based on the artwork. I don't agree with that at all. The kinds of hands I'm talking about is not simply just picking something up or clutching something, because the pseudo-dragon can do that, the owl can do that. I'm talking about hands where you could pick up a key, put it in a lock, and turn it. I'm talking about hands, as we know hands, not some kind of version of a claw that can clutch. That's not what I'm talking about at all. Having a claw that can clutch, still valuable. That's still really good, of course, but hands open up vistas that familiars just don't normally have. So let's just jump ahead here then with hands and talk about what you're going to be able to do with hands. And one of the things, of course, is that they'll be able to use things. So using magic items, for example, is a big, big deal because they'll be able to do that as well without having to take Investment at the Chainmaster. If you give the Imp a wand or the Quasit a wand or whatever, the Sprite a wand, the Skeleton a wand, they're going to be able to use that without having to have Investment at the Chainmaster. So something like a Wand of Magic Missiles is an uncommon magic item. Now, attunement needs to be talked about here as well, because now this ruling is from a couple years ago. I have no idea if it's even been updated just yet because the rule set is so newly out. But in Adventurers League, what they were doing, and Adventurers League is a pretty good standard to look at. It doesn't mean that this is the rule is written, because this is just the practice that was common in Adventurers League. With attunement, what they were often doing with folks that had a Pact of the Chain familiar is an attuned item to a familiar counted against the warlock's attunement slots. Now, you could make this argument either way, obviously, but that is simply what they were doing. And I think from a balance standpoint, that certainly obviously seems fair to me. But I can easily see why you would want to argue with your DM and not have that happen. The real question then becomes, for me, is if it's my attunement slot, does that mean, and I don't have an answer for you here, but the question would be, if it's my attunement slot and I'm a warlock and the familiar is using it, but it's my attunement slot, could the Imp or whoever attune to an item that only a spellcaster or a warlock, for example, could attune to? That's the big question there, because it is, if we're saying it's coming from me and there is some link, you could make arguments here. I don't have an opinion one way or the other per se. I think that my DM sense tells me that that's just big time danger to allow a familiar to have something that only a spellcaster could attune to. That there's differences in variations. They're powerful. The familiar is powerful enough. You don't need to be giving them major magic items, but it is something that I don't believe is a settled matter at this point. However, if it turns out that I'm wrong about that, I will certainly note that in the pinned comment. Always check the pinned comment for stuff like that. So magic items that fall into the safe area, maybe requiring attunement, but aren't specifically attuned to spellcasters or warlocks, you definitely want the familiar to have a bag of holding. In a bag of holding, and a lot of what I'm about to talk about, I'm assuming that you'll have a bag of holding. That's your number one priority, especially with something like the imp. The reason why is the imp has a strength of 6. Now, as a tiny creature, you are able to carry 7.5 pounds of weight per strength point, which means that the imp can carry 45 pounds. 45 pounds is insanely strong for a flying, invisible creature. That's amazing. Now, a bag of holding weighs 15. So even holding on to the bag of holding, they still have 30 pounds to play with. But in that bag of holding, you put in all sorts of stuff. And here I'm touching on stuff that I've already talked about in the other video, but that's all right. Very briefly, you want to put healing potions in there. Healing potions are a common magic item. You put those in there, the imp will be able to revive you if you should fall, or be able to act as a medic if necessary. Now, here's some newer stuff. You want to put tools in that bag of holding. And I mean like every kind of conceivable tool. So you want to put a saw, you want to put a hammer, you want to put spikes, you want to put pythons, you want to put a pole, you want to put rope, you want to put chains, you want to put a chisel, you want to put a file. I would even put manacles, not necessarily a tool, but a tool of sorts for an adventurer. Any of those things are going to be very useful. Oh, and thieves' tools, of course. Put thieves' tools in. You never know. The point is that the familiar, having all that available to them, all those kind of tools, and what I just mentioned is just off the top of my head here. So just obviously the more well-equipped you can make the imp, the better. The point is that while it's scouting ahead or doing its thing, if it should run into a problem that it can't deal with, there may be a tool in the bag that will help. But also, in the kind of scenarios where you are, say, captured, and the imp is not, and it's flying around, it has those kind of resources to either use to help infiltrate, to get to you, or to give to you to help you extricate yourself from your situation. There's all kinds of reasons why having those kind of tools on hand is always going to be useful. It's just obviously will be useful to have them, and having the imp tote them around in the bag of holding only adds to a certain level of utility and ability and flexibility for the party. Now, people like to talk about the imp dropping caltrips and all that type of stuff. If that's what you want to do, I mean, sure. I would personally just rather do the help action, but there are times, I guess, where dropping caltrips might be preferable. But to me, I would rather, if I'm having the imp do something, I'd rather them have a wand of magic missiles or do the help action or anything of that nature. Now, I should point out here that there's a slight difference between the advice in the old rules to now. And that is that if the imp is invisible, if it has a wand and it casts a spell like magic missile, it was doing so using the use magic item action before, which technically wouldn't violate its invisibility. But now, I think you are just simply using the magic action and you are casting a spell through the wand. And so you, I think, almost certainly are violating the imp's invisibility. So it isn't quite as great as it used to be, but if you do have a wand, an offensive-minded wand with the imp or another invisible creature, I don't advise using it willy-nilly. I would say use it when you really need it. When it's a high-pressure combat situation, then you go ahead and do that. So let me jump off into a sidebar topic that's very critical. I've talked about it in other videos, but it bears repeating here. When you are creating your character, if you intend on doing Pact of the Chain, it is absolutely essential that you take the alert feat. And the reason why is that alert now gives you the ability to transpose with another ally. So by having a familiar that's rolling its own initiative, you are giving yourself a kind of advantage situation just innately to your character. But if you have one of the 3 familiars that can turn invisible, and if they are invisible at the beginning of the combat, invisible creatures at the beginning of the combat roll initiative with advantage. So you will be able to have the imp roll, or whoever, roll with advantage, and you're rolling your initiative as normal with your bonus from alert, and then taking the best outcome possible. So you're basically rolling with a pseudo super advantage. That's way, way too powerful to pass up. Okay, now let's talk about something that I didn't talk about at all in the last video, I don't believe. And it's a pretty important topic, and I'm kind of surprised that I didn't bring it up, but I don't think I did. I think I was so on the mechanics. This is a very important topic. It's about the power of being tiny. So not only is the imp flying and invisible, and really all the familiars are really tiny, but except for one. The imp is flying, invisible, has hands, and is tiny. This is a really important distinction because of things like this. So let's just take a pretty common situation that's going to happen in D&D. So you are facing some kind of self-contained fortress that is pretty much impregnable. There's really no way for you to get in. So the first question you ask is there a chimney? And the DM will probably tell you there is. There almost certainly has to be in a situation like that. So you say, well, all right, I'm sending the imp flying and invisible up to the chimney, and it's going down. Whoa, 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 the game master tells you. It's a pretty small chimney. Well, the imp's tiny. Okay. But there's a big fire going on at the bottom, and there's smoke and heat and fire coming up the chimney. Well, the imp's immune to fire. Oh. And the imp's in. This is such a rinse and repeat strategy to defeat, I don't know, almost any kind of dwelling in the medieval level kind of world. It's staggering how effective this ability is. And so once inside, of course, the imp has got its own intelligence, and if it knows what its mission is, it's going to go and execute it. It's invisible. It has a bag of holding with a whole bunch of tools inside of it, and it's going to go and find a door to open to allow the party in. Conversely, things like that, so the imp is immune to poison and to fire. So conversely, if there's a room full of poison gas, that's something that can happen often, and you may need to go back into that room for some particular reason. Send the imp, no problem, you're good. This is a pretty common scenario, whether it be from traps or whatever, in dungeons that the room fills with poison gas. You'll still be able to navigate that room with the imp. But I don't want to get off topic about the immunities. Those are important to note. The power is in being tiny, because there is no chimney that is going to be built that the imp is not going to be able to get down. Why? Because it can shapeshift too. It can shapeshift into a spider. So as a spider, it's going to be able to get down there. Now, when you take that and you start looking at doors and you start saying, what is the gap between the door and the floor? Can the imp transform into a spider? Not a giant spider, mind you. We're talking about a spider. Will it be able to crawl under the door? I think probably, yeah. If not, enter the closet. The closet can shapeshift into a centipede. The centipede should be able to get under almost any given door. So whether by their own innate tininess and combination of hands, or their ability, both of those are the only familiars that can shapeshift, the ability to get even smaller to be able to get through a scenario and bypass locked impregnable doors, locked impregnable fortresses, whatever, is unreal. I can't overstate this. It's unbelievably powerful, and it always has shocked me every time I've played D&D where I've had a character that had access to something like this, or was playing a kind of character that could do these kinds of things, how quickly the table went on tilt. Everyone knew that I could fly and be invisible or whatever, and then when they started seeing what could happen, everyone's jaw almost universally drops. This is why I am so concerned about trying to protect. I was in the video 4 years ago, so concerned about protecting the imp, because DMs will try to get rid of a familiar like this. Now, you're pretty much immune to that as a big threat. I mean, they may be able to remove the familiar for a combat, but you're just going to snap your fingers and get it right back. So the sprite is another one of these. I haven't talked at all about the sprite. The sprite does have some utility in two particular features. One is that it has stealth. It has the highest of the stealth skills. Now, I think that stealth, people, when they try and talk to me about how great the sprite is, they always bring up the stealth. To me, if you're flying and you're invisible, your stealth is taken care of already. I mean, yes, I know that it can come up, but it's pretty much over. But the scenarios that I'm going to talk about, having a little bit of stealth could be useful. It also has that heart sight ability to be able to know a creature's alignment, true alignment. That can occasionally be useful. So, at the snap of the fingers, turning it into a sprite to do something like that is certainly something to think about. The sprite only has a strength of 3, so it's only able to carry 22.5 pounds. The closet has a strength of 5, so it's going to carry 37.5 pounds. And again, the imp has a strength of 6, so it can carry 45. Which brings me to my next familiar to talk about, and that is the much maligned and much overlooked skeleton. The skeleton is a medium-sized creature. It's the only one that is. Now, aside from just the coolness factor, at least in my opinion, of having a skeleton familiar that's always following you around, it's a medium-sized creature with a 10 strength. Now, as a medium creature, it carries double what a tiny creature can. So it's now getting 15 pounds of carrying weight. So the skeleton can carry 150 pounds. Now, folks, that's a lot of weight. And it has hands. It can't fly normally, and it can't turn invisible. But if you give it investment of the Chainmaster, it can fly, and it can carry 150 pounds. What could you do with a flying creature that could carry 150 pounds? Oh, that's right. You could be ferrying characters across difficult problems. So if there's a chasm or whatever and people can't fly, granted you're only going to be able to do this from 5th level forward. But if that's a problem, you're going to be able to have the skeleton, not all characters, because there's going to be plenty of characters that weigh over 150 pounds, but there's going to be plenty that don't. Or if you're playing a slightly lighter kind of race of a creature, as your main character, you could even have the skeleton be flying you around in combat while you Eldritch Blast all the way around. So you're getting concentration-free flight from your familiar. You could even do this with the imp if you were playing a small creature, but and theoretically, if the imp does do that, it turns anything it's carrying invisible. So that creates a whole different craziness to it. So the skeleton has surprising utility, and also the skeleton and the sprite are the only two that come with armament when you summon them. Why do they get weapons? I don't know, but they do. So if you need a ranged attack, the skeleton has a short bow. I mean, and if it has flight, that could be useful. So don't just turn out of hand the idea of summoning the skeleton or changing the familiar into a skeleton. It's going to have its uses. Now, aside from it flying, just the fact that it can carry 150 pounds is going to be useful in a number of scenarios that kind of come up in D&D, where you have stuff you have to carry and you don't want a party member being burdened with it. Well, that's what you can do with a skeleton. I'm not saying that I would make the skeleton my main familiar, I think you should generally be toggling between the imp and the pseudo-dragon, possibly the quasit if you've got investment. And that's going to be a pretty tough juggling act. But just keep in mind, this is Pact of the Chain familiars now and what to do with them. One of the things to do with them is to change them as the need fits for the situation. To that matter, there's things like the slod. Now, the slod is generally, in my opinion, it's almost hot garbage. But it does have a 10-foot burrow speed. That may be useful. The problem you're going to have with the 10-foot burrow speed, so you're having it get under someplace, that's great. But then what does it do on the other side? If all you need is a visual report of what's inside, then the slod could be a great pick. If you can't get a familiar in any other way, a burrow speed could do it. So that, I think, is one of the big reasons to ever convert a familiar into the slod tadpole. So by no means is this all of the things that you can do with Pact of the Chain familiars, but it does cover a lot of the most important things, I think. And as time goes by, I will probably do an additional video of maybe different things that didn't occur to me before, or there might be new items that come out, or different effects or abilities that come out, or different interactions that come out, or come to me that are worth talking about. And so we'll explore those as well. All right. Well, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed the video, please like, please share, please subscribe. And if you're stuck and you don't know where to go, you can always search for a secret door. Until next time, I cast bless on all of you.